Hello, I am Ruby Falconer. Today's date is July 20th, 2020, and this is an astrological update for the upcoming week from the perspective of shamanic Egyptian astrology. Today is a new moon, and this is the second new moon that we have had in the sign of Cancer. The first one took place on the solstice, which this year was the night of the 20th and the 21st. It was accompanied by a solar eclipse. And so that was at 0 degrees Cancer. And so we have this second Cancer new moon on the 28th degree of Cancer. This entire month has been very Cancerian, meaning it's been very emotional. Emotions have been running high, feelings have been running high. And the thing about Cancer is the sign that has to do with the ebb and flow of the tides. It is ruled by the moon, and of course the moon, the gravitational pull of the moon, has a great impact on Earth, on our tides of the waters, of our oceans, and also on the tides, the ebb and flow of the waters within our own bodies. So our emotions tend to rise and fall with the movement of the moon, which is why the full moon is such an important time for us all and has, for many of us, a very strong emotional content. So here we are at a new moon. This is not an eclipse. This is a regular new moon, but it's the second one in the sign Cancer, so that makes it important. And what also makes this particular new moon important is there's a station of Eris going on. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that in a minute. But I want to also acknowledge that this particular new moon is opposite the great shift planets. Most specifically, it is opposite by degree to the planet Saturn, who is Sobek, the old king in the language of shamanic Egyptian astrology. But it's also opposite to the other two planets that are part of the great shift energy, which is Jupiter and Pluto. So that energy is definitely being activated during this particular new moon window. And it is forming a T-square with Eris. Eris is the Greek goddess of strife and discord. Her Roman name was Discordia. And again, I'm going to come back to her in a minute. But I also want to acknowledge, since we're right here on the day of the new moon, that this is the second day of the dark moon window. Each month at the new moon, we have a 3-day period when the moon is not visible from here on Earth. Essentially what's happening at the new moon is the moon is orbiting around the Earth. Here's the sun. The moon's orbiting around the Earth. And at the new moon, it gets very close to the sun. Now, when you have eclipse, it's right aligned with the sun. But most of the time, it's either a little below or it's a little above. And so it's not affecting our view of the sun from here on planet Earth. That's what happens when we have an eclipse, is the moon is basically blocking our view of the sun. But nonetheless, because it's so close to the sun, we can't see it. So at night, there's no moon. It's a moonless night. And that happens every month around the time of the new moon for 3 days, with the exact point being that second day of that new moon, the new moon window. And it's, the ancients would call it the dark moon window. And for shamanic peoples, this was a time of contemplation. It was a time of introspection. It was a time when they would go into themselves, that they might find a way to separate themselves from the community so that they could go inward through ritual, through ceremony, because they wanted to release the previous moon cycle. The moon cycle was extremely important to shamanic peoples, and they wanted to open up to allow whatever was going to come in with the next moon cycle. So they would be letting go, purifying themselves in some way, and opening up. And it would be important for us to find some way to do that for ourselves, to honor that dark moon. I've said this before, but for shamanic peoples, the new moon actually did not occur until that first sliver of the moon was visible. So the moon had to move a little bit, had to get a little bit away from the sun so that the sun could shed some light on it at night. And you see that first sliver of the crescent moon which happens about 2 nights after the exact new moon. So we have those 3 nights of absolute exact darkness. And then, if you're in the right place on Earth, you have the right visibility, you might see that sliver. Certainly by the third night after the new moon, you're going to see that sliver, the crescent moon. And for them, that was the new moon. That was the beginning of the new cycle. So they would begin their cycle with the actual first viewing of the moon itself. That's how shamanic peoples were. They were very in tune with what went on with nature, but they also could observe, direct observation. So what you could see had a tremendous amount of impact on them. And when you could first see the moon, that was important. Before that, it was darkness. For them, they would go into the cave in some way, internally go within. So I wanted to bring that up because that's where we are right now. We're on that second day of the dark moon window. And so it's important to take some time to go within. And there's a lot of reasons to go within otherwise because this is such an intense period. As I said earlier, we've been in, had a lot of Cancer energy going on. We had Mercury retrograde, it's now direct. We've had a lot of intensity going on around that for a while. Mercury and Chiron were both running together. They were both stationary and they were moving in a square. We've had Mercury square to Mars. And in fact, Mercury is going to be moving into another square with Mars beginning tomorrow, beginning the 21st. And so Mercury is now direct in Cancer and it will be square first to Mars and then to Chiron, and that's going to take place from the 21st through the 27th, so it extends into next week. And the last time that happened was earlier this month. It was from the 7th through the 13th. Yes, that's correct. And so that was a pretty intense time because at that point, Mars was newly in Aries. Chiron was slowing to station. Mercury was becoming stationary. Both of them were changing direction, Mercury and Chiron in square to each other. And so there was a lot around the wounded warrior and internalizing the wounded warrior, feeling the emotions and feelings of the warrior within ourselves. Now everything's direct. Mars is direct. Chiron's now retrograde. Mercury is direct, and so that the energy that's coming in now, beginning on the 21st and going through the 27th, is a completion. Mercury is going to be completing its lengthy sojourn in Cancer on August 4th. It's going to exit and enter into Leo. And so that energy is going to be different, there's going to be a shift around that. But we are going to have for this next week, Mercury, first of all, squaring Mars and then squaring Chiron. And so some of that energy that we had earlier in the month is still here. And it's kind of a completion of it, but it's nonetheless here. And the way that filters down to us is a lot of sensitivity and communication, a certain amount of anger, a certain amount of frustration. All of those energies are here. We do have a shift coming up this week on Wednesday when the sun enters Leo, and that's going to be the beginning of Leo energy coming in. It's going to amplify when early August Mercury moves into Leo as well. And Leo's a very different sort of sign. While Cancer is a water sign and it's very much about our emotions and feelings and our desire to feel safe and secure, Leo is about our desire to express ourselves out in the world in some way. And so it's traditionally known as the sign of leadership. It's also the sign of creativity. And so it often, on an individual level, expresses itself in those two areas of life, both in taking leadership in some way, or in being a leader by expressing one's creativity. A lot of people in the creative arts, particularly acting, singing, performing in some way, have their sun or other prominent planets in the sign Leo. All of the signs grow out of one another, and when we reach Cancer, there's an integration process that goes on. Aries is about the desire to be. Taurus is grounding that desire to be in physical reality. Gemini thinks about it, and then Cancer integrates all of this energy, and it does it in the home. That's the place where this energy can be integrated is in a place to nest, so to speak. And the end result of this integration is the first time in the zodiac wheel that we have a whole and complete individual, and that's in the sign Leo. But the thing about Leo is it's young and it needs to be recognized and acknowledged. Now, I have a joke about Leo. If you want to annoy a Leo, just ignore them. That's true for anybody with a lot of Leo in their chart. That need to be acknowledged, to be recognized, and to be heard is extremely important. And I joke about it, but really it's not funny, because if an individual has grown up in an environment where they're not heard, they're not acknowledged, they're not recognized, that's extremely painful to one's sense of self. And so that becomes a core wound from childhood. And in shamanic Egyptian astrology, Leo is aligned with Anubis. And the thing about Anubis was an abandoned child. And as an abandoned child, he has to grow through those wounds. He has to find a way to release those wounds in order to become the person, the individual, the God that he was meant to be, to find his soul purpose, his true path in life. There's a whole story around that and how he does that, and I'm not going to tell it now, but I just want to acknowledge that when we move into the sign Leo, Leo's sometimes associated with the bluff and bluster and the enthusiasm and the charisma and the magnetism of leadership, and that's all there too. But there's also an aspect of Leo that is about that desire to be recognized, acknowledged, and seen. And so we need to remember that as things start to shift into Leo, is that on a collective level, we're all going to need to be recognized. It's important to be listening to each other. In Cancer, we've been concerned about what it is that makes us feel safe and secure. In Leo, it's going to be about that need to be recognized and acknowledged. So I want to come back to Eris for a few minutes, because Eris is an important part of the solar system and an important part of the astrological symbolism these days. And it wasn't always, back when I started my work as an astrologer a long time ago, back in 1973 when I first started studying astrology, Eris was not known to exist. Eris was discovered by science, by astronomy in January 5th, 2005. And Eris, true to her name, goddess of strife and discord, immediately kind of threw a monkey wrench into the solar system design, because as it turned out, they discovered very quickly that Eris was much larger than Pluto. Eris is very far out in the solar system. Right now, Eris is about as far out in the solar system as it gets. Its orbit around the sun is 559 years, so it's a huge amount of time. And it has a very elliptical orbit. So while a lot of the planets are more or less circular, not all of them, but we have this kind of moving around the sun like this, Eris is more like this. Okay, so it's way out there, and Eris right now is way out there, almost off the screen here. So it's about as far away from the sun and far away from the rest of the planets that it can get. And this is important in mythology, because who Eris was, she's that goddess of strife and discord. She's the one who nobody wanted around. She's sometimes considered to be the feminine warrior. She's associated with Mars, sometimes considered to be a sister. It kind of depends on what myth you read. But what's most important about her in mythology is she is the one who was the instigator, in a sense, of the Trojan War. And if you are familiar with Greek and Roman myth at all, the story of the Trojan War is that the king of Sparta, his wife was Helen, and she was kidnapped and taken to Troy. There was a huge war around that. And the way that war was initiated or started was there was a wedding that was taking place, and all of the gods and goddesses were invited except Eris. So she was not invited. And she was pretty angry about that because she didn't like being left out. So she showed up anyway, and she threw a golden apple that was inscribed "to the most beautiful" into the group. And three goddesses claimed it because they considered themselves to be the most beautiful. There was Hera, there was Athena, and there was Aphrodite. Well, Hera was Zeus's wife. You know, he's the king of Mount Olympus. His name was Jupiter to the Romans. Zeus was his Greek name. Hera was Zeus's wife. Athena was his sister, and Aphrodite, no, excuse me, his daughter, and Aphrodite was his half sister. So he didn't want any part of that. You know, he didn't want to have to decide who was the most beautiful. So he enlisted Paris, who was a Trojan shepherd, to come in and choose. Well, Paris chose Aphrodite. And Aphrodite, as wanting to reward Paris, told him that he could have the most beautiful woman in the world. Well, that turned out to be Helen, who was the queen of Sparta. And so Aphrodite helped Paris basically kidnap Helen and get her to fall in love with him. And he took her home to Troy. And so Greece declared war on Troy, which led to the Trojan War, which was a huge, Homer wrote about it. It was a huge story in Greek myth. A lot of the heroes of the time died. That's where Achilles died, many of the others as well. So a lot of death. It cost a lot of money. It went on for 10 years, and a lot of the gods and goddesses got involved. So it's one of those major myths of the ancient Greek world. Well, one of the ways that we can see Eris operating in other archetypal myths is in the myth of the Sleeping Beauty. She is the angry woman who, the angry fairy, who again is not invited to a wedding, and so she curses the offspring of the newlyweds, who turns out to be Sleeping Beauty. And in the movie Maleficent, and I'm talking about the first version of this movie, we see Eris in Maleficent. But I like that movie if we want to understand Eris, and I think in this day and time it's very important to understand Eris because we start to see her backstory. And the long of the short of it, Eris is the excluded one. She's the marginalized one. She's angry and upset and discontent because she's pushed out. She's not included, and there's no way she can change that. She cannot allow herself to or she cannot figure out a way to allow herself to be included. And so she becomes very angry and very discontented. And so she sows discord wherever she can. And so another version of a way of looking at her is that she is that discord that starts to happen when there is injustice, the discontent that starts to happen when people are living under a system that is essentially unfair. And I think we could really understand this is if we look at some of the events that have taken place since 2005, since Eris was discovered. And what happens when a planet is discovered is it comes into our collective psyche in a more conscious way, and it begins to make an impact. And because Eris is as far out as she can get in her orbit, and her orbit's huge, again, 559 years. She is in the sign Aries now, and she has been in the sign Aries since 1925. And she's going to stay in the sign Aries until 1947. So that's a huge amount of time. When she's on much closer to the sun, she stays in the opposite signs, Libra, for instance, in a much shorter period of time. She's in over 100 years, 100 and whatever it is, almost 125 years in the sign Aries. And most recently, if we look at the Me Too movement, what was happening then is Eris was moving in relationship to Jupiter, in relationship to the planet Uranus. And so we had an eruption from the subconscious of anger of the collective yin. I'm not going to say feminine, the collective yin over decades and decades, and really in some ways centuries, of use of sexuality as a means to power, and the abuse of disempowered people along the way. More recently, we have seen Eris in relationship to the great shift planets, and most specifically in relationship to Pluto. Eris has been in relationship to Pluto since early 2018. And in relationship to all three of the great shift planets, all of this year, 2020. And so the Black Lives Matter movement, and most particularly the more recent sort of eruption of understanding of what's actually going on with systemic racism, because the Black Lives Matter movement has been around for quite a while. Eris has been doing her work. She's been, that discontent that comes out of an unfair system. That's the thing with Eris. In Greek and Roman myth, she's considered a problem, basically, because she's just not happy. But we have to remember that the cultures of Greek and Rome were very imbalanced. They were what we could call patriarchal. And I have to be careful with that word because I don't want people to think it's about gender. The way I define the patriarchy, it's a system that values action more than receptivity. So we could think about yin and yang. Yin is our receptive qualities. We all have a receptive pole within us, no matter what gender we are, or if we're multigender, if we're binary, we still have a receptive pole, and we have an active pole, yang energy. We've all got yin and we've all got yang. In the centuries, and it literally is centuries, many centuries, thousands of years of time of the imbalance, there has been an overvaluing of yang energy and a marginalization of yin energy. And so that's the setup for Eris, because she was pushed out and she got pissed about it. And so when somebody is pushed out, when they're not included, when they're not part of, whether it's in a relationship, in a family, you just think about the black sheep of the family, or collectively in a culture, if people are in some ways marginalized, if they are disempowered, if they are taken advantage of, if they are manipulated, if they are used, they may be powerless to take action, but the discontent is going to brew. And very often there's going to be ways where there's strife, and that strife may be under the surface for a long time. But it's been very interesting since your Eris has come to our collective consciousness in 2005. There have been times when this long simmering discontent has bubbled over and we become aware of what's going on. And it's really important to understand that Eris is not the bad goddess. She's certainly the angry goddess, no doubt about that. But she's angry at injustice and marginalization, and there's a place for it. What's important around that is how we allow her to affect us and how we use her. Now, I'm talking about Eris here because she's stationary, and in some ways, the 2-day stationary period, which is today the 20th and tomorrow the 21st, is kind of a joke, because really, that's mathematically, or astronomically, when we could say she's exactly stationary. She's been stationary for quite a while. She's been on this 24th degree of Aries in some ways since May of 2019, and she's going to be there from until February of 2027. And there's times when she's retrograded onto the 23rd degree, and there'll be times when she goes into the 25th degree, but she won't be done with that 24th degree of Aries until February of 2027, and she began her transit of that 24th degree in May of 2019. So I'm making this point that stationary is it's kind of relative. She's been hanging around this same place all of 2020, and really making us aware of what's the discontent and the anger. And in some ways that's what we feel. We feel that discontent, we feel that anger. And it's very important for us as individuals to see the bigger picture. It's interesting that she's as far out in the solar system, her brothers and sisters, the solar system's her family, she's as far out as she can get. She's way out there, so she's not close to her planet siblings at all right now. She's really feeling left out. And so we're really feeling her effect during this period. It's going to go on for a while. And so what's important is to see the bigger picture. That there's reasons that people feel this discontent and this unhappiness. She's pissed off at injustice. If there was that movie network where people were yelling out their window, "I'm sick and tired and I'm not going to take it anymore." That's Eris. So we see her a lot of ways, and we can have a reaction to her because it can feel like she's a troublemaker, and she is. She's disempowered, but she's pissed off. So we can have some empathy. So what I wanted to do today, since she's so prominent right now, and it really is prominent during this period of time, I wanted to take everyone on a journey with Eris. And the thing about Eris is I don't have a counterpart for her in shamanic Egyptian astrology. And if some of you have a suggestion around that, I would like to hear it. For me, the difference between the Egyptian archetypes and the Greek and Roman archetypes upon which Western astrology is based is patriarchal energy. Greece and Rome were deeply patriarchal cultures. All of the power was in the hands of the men. And you can see that in the myths, in that the power was held by the male characters, the young characters. And it doesn't mean that there weren't powerful goddesses. There were, but a lot of the goddesses, they would be kidnapped, they would be raped. They had to express their anger through revenge. There's a lot of that going on. So it was a very dysfunctional family, in the Greek and Roman archetypes. It's not that that kind of stuff doesn't happen in the Egyptian myths. It does, but it's more like an equal opportunity between the poles. The yin and the yang were more evenly balanced when we go back into the Egyptian myths. So for that reason, I'm not feeling into right now, this may change with time, an Egyptian archetype that I can identify with Eris. She seems to be a product of that imbalance, that discontent that is sown by unfairness, that comes as a result of an imbalance in power. So she's very unique in that way to the patriarchal times that we've lived in for thousands of years, and still, in many ways, still living in them, even though we have more consciousness around it. So I would like to invite everyone to go on a journey today with Eris to see what information she has for you, specifically in your own life, your own discontent, your own resentment, your own desire for revenge, any of those places that are coming up, and also an opportunity to see the bigger picture, to see how she works collectively on all of us, on the society that we live in. So please take a nice deep breath. Allow yourself to drop down into your body. Let go of any distractions. Allow yourself to come present. And I want you to imagine that you are walking through a desert. Deserts have their own kind of beauty. There's a beauty in their starkness. There's a beauty in the colors of the land. But there's not much water. These are arid places. There's not much green. There's no trees. There can be some cacti, some other things that grow on the desert. But this is an arid place, arid and dry. And you have to be prepared when you go into it because there's not a lot of nurturance. So imagine that you are here, walking through this desert place. And you're looking for a place to stop. A place that has a little bit of shelter, whether it's from a rock or a bluff. A place that feel sacred in some way. Perhaps the color of the rocks, the spacing of them. And in this place, I want you to find a place to be. And we are going to call out now to Eris, Discordia, that principle of discontent, irritation, anger, that feeling of being left out, not being included, of being marginalized, being discounted, being demeaned in some way. We want to invite that in. And you find yourself joined now by Eris. She comes in a form that is unique to you. This is a powerful goddess. Not in a direct way, not the way the young god Mars can be. But she's got power of her own. This isn't like Sekhmet, the fierce feminine warrior. This goddess feeds on our discontent. It triggers that part of her that feels left out, not included. She doesn't matter. So she comes forth, and if you are willing, look into her eyes, and you will see mirrored in her eyes those places within you where you feel marginalized, you feel discontented, you feel not included in some way, or perhaps you have been at some time in your life. I know a lot of you have done a lot of personal work. We can do a lot of healing of these places, but we cannot make them go away. They still exist within us, even when we learn to respond to them differently. But I invite you to let her show you those places, to mirror to you those places where they still exist within you. I'm going to be quiet now for a couple of minutes and let you commune with Eris. Let her show you any places of discontent or dissatisfaction within you. Deep breath. And I want to invite you now to look at that image of yourself mirrored in her eyes and allow yourself to feel compassion for this being. Perhaps this discontent comes from some family system or some societal system that truly is unfair. For that is what Eris hones in on: injustice, unfairness. The things that have established themselves that are essentially unfair, whether it is in a system, family system, a society system, a governmental system, or in a way that we are treated as a result of the way that system has been woven into the structure. So feel compassion for that mirror image of yourself, for those times when you've wanted revenge, for those times when you've just been absolutely pissed off, for those times when you felt hatred, for those times when you felt fury, for those times when you've cried because you were so hurt by the unfairness of it all. And allow that awareness to spread out now and to see the way that it's not just your story. How is this story of unfairness, this story of injustice, part of a system in some way, a family system, a societal system, a cultural system, a religious system? You're a girl, you can't do this. You're a boy, you can't do this. You have to be this. We need you to be this. Feel compassion for that rejected aspect of self. And take that compassion now and send some of it back to Eris. For her service to us is to bring the unfairness and the injustice to our attention. That's what she's doing for us, is helping us to see it and to feel it with our own bodies, even if it's not our story. Even if we've never been sexually manipulated by a person in power, Eris helps us to feel that pain. Even if we can't understand what it's like to be a minority in our country, to be disempowered by the color of our skin or our religion or our gender, Eris helps us to feel it. So spend some time sending some compassion and appreciation to her for her service to us. And perhaps Eris changes at this point in some way. And I invite you to join me in thanking Eris for making herself known to us and pointing out to us the errors in our ways, the problems in our systems, the ways we exclude people and marginalize them and discount them. She makes us aware of that. So let us say thank you to her. She helps us to begin the process of identifying with other people's pain, even if it's not been our own experience. We can begin to say to one another, hello, another myself. And so I invite you to say that to Eris, hello, another myself. For her pain is your pain. We've all felt that pain of rejection, of marginalization, of being discounted in some way. Eris lives in all of us. And joining you now is Isis, that beautiful goddess of the multicolored wings. She wraps her rainbow wings around you, and you lie back in her arms. Isis never rejects us. And perhaps she extends her wings to Eris and pulls her in too, so that Eris can receive some healing. This fierce and angry goddess can find some solace in being recognized and acknowledged. Some wrongs can be righted through the process of being seen. And just take a moment to enjoy the presence of Isis. And holding that energy close to your heart, making a commitment to yourself to take some time over the next couple of nights to acknowledge the power of this great goddess, this service that she's performing us all by making us aware of injustice. Acknowledging her existence within each of us. Take a nice deep breath and come back into the room. Thank you for being with me, and we will talk again.